You don't walk away from someone and then come back expecting nothing changed. The words cut through the quiet morning air as Sarah Mitchell stood outside the small apartment complex in downtown Denver, holding a worn cardboard box filled with whatever she and her son Ethan could carry after being given an eviction notice for unpaid rent. The November wind was cold enough to sting her fingers, but she tightened her grip on the box anyway, forcing herself not to look back at the door that had just closed behind them for the last time. Ethan, a 5-year-old boy with soft brown hair and eyes too observant for his age, tugged gently at her sleeve and asked in a quiet voice where they were going now, and Sarah bent down slightly, brushing his hair aside as she told him they would figure it out together, even though she had no idea what that meant anymore. Life had been a sequence of survival decisions for the past 3 years, ever since the day William Hayes disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only silence where promises used to be. She had stopped expecting answers long ago, but she never stopped feeling the weight of them. Across the city, in the top-floor conference room of Hayes Global, William Hayes stood motionless in front of a glass wall overlooking the skyline, his expression unreadable as he listened to his assistant speak about the new community outreach initiative the company was sponsoring. He was still the same man the world saw as untouchable, a billionaire CEO with influence stretching across industries, but something in his eyes had changed in a way no one around him could fully understand. When he saw the name Sarah Mitchell on the project file, something sharp and uninvited moved through his chest, like a memory that refused to stay buried. He did not react outwardly, but for the first time in years, his focus broke. That afternoon, Sarah walked into a small community center on the edge of the city, seeking temporary work through a staffing program she had signed up for earlier that week, unaware that the same building was part of a corporate partnership funded by Hayes Global. Ethan held her hand tightly as they stepped inside, his small shoes echoing softly on the tile floor, while Sarah tried to steady her breathing and remind herself that dignity still mattered even when life was falling apart. She was directed to a waiting area where several applicants sat quietly, and as she took a seat, she noticed a familiar logo on the pamphlets stacked on the table, one she had seen before in a life that now felt distant and unreal. Minutes passed slowly until the room shifted slightly, as if the air itself had changed, and when she looked up she saw him. William Hayes was standing at the far end of the hallway, speaking briefly with staff, but the moment his eyes moved across the room, everything stopped. Sarah did not move. Ethan looked up at the man beside him and asked softly why that stranger was staring at them, and Sarah felt her heartbeat tighten as recognition finally settled in fully, not just in her mind but in her body, in every memory she had tried to bury. William took one step forward, then another, slower now, as if distance itself had become uncertain, and for a moment neither of them spoke because words felt too small for what was happening between them. Sarah was the first to break the silence, her voice steady but heavy, asking him why he was there now after everything, and William's answer came quietly, almost like it cost him something to say it out loud. "I didn't leave you the way you think I did." The room around them continued moving, people passing, papers being shuffled, life continuing as if nothing had shifted, but between Sarah Mitchell and William Hayes, time had already collapsed into something neither of them was ready to face. The silence between them did not break immediately, it stretched, heavy and unstable, as if the entire room was waiting for someone to decide what reality they were going to accept. Sarah Mitchell finally exhaled, her hand instinctively moving closer to Ethan, who was now holding on to her coat without fully understanding why the air felt different. Her eyes stayed locked on William Hayes, searching his face for something familiar and finding too much of it, too much history buried behind a calm expression that no longer felt distant, but painfully close. William did not look away, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a controlled restraint that barely concealed the weight behind every word. He asked Sarah to step outside with him for a moment, not as an order, but as a request that sounded like it had been rehearsed in his mind long before this moment ever arrived. Sarah hesitated, her instincts tightening, but Ethan tugged her hand lightly and asked if they were going to be okay, and that question alone made her decision for her. She nodded once and guided him toward a quieter hallway just beyond the main room, where the noise of the building softened into a distant hum. William followed at a careful distance, as if giving her space was the only thing he knew how to offer correctly. When they stopped near a long window overlooking the street, Sarah turned to him first, her voice steady but sharpened by years of unanswered questions. She asked him where he had been, why he had disappeared, and why she had spent years explaining his absence to a child who deserved more than silence. William lowered his gaze for a moment, as though each question carried more weight than the last, and when he finally answered, his words were slower, deliberate, and carefully chosen. He said he did not leave because he wanted to, and that every decision after that moment had been made under pressure she never saw from the outside. He mentioned legal complications, corporate restrictions, and a situation that forced him into a separation that was never explained properly, not even to himself in the way he would have needed to understand it. Sarah listened without interrupting, but her expression tightened with every sentence, not because she doubted his words, but because none of them had reached her when they mattered most. Ethan stood quietly between them, looking up at both adults as if trying to assemble a story that did not yet make sense. William's eyes eventually shifted to the boy, and something in his expression changed, a subtle fracture in his composure that no business meeting or boardroom had ever created. He asked Sarah softly how old Ethan was, and when she answered 5 years old, there was a brief pause that felt heavier than anything said so far. The realization did not need to be spoken aloud, it settled in the space between them with quiet inevitability. William stepped slightly closer, then stopped, as if unsure whether he had the right to reduce the distance he himself had created. Sarah immediately noticed it, and reminded him that closeness did not erase time, and time was exactly what had been taken from them. William did not argue, only nodded once, acknowledging something deeper than agreement, something closer to regret. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and the only sound was the distant movement of people behind glass doors, continuing their day unaware of the shift happening just beyond their sight. Ethan broke the silence by asking if William was going to stay or leave again, and the question landed with quiet force, making Sarah close her eyes for a second before opening them again. William looked at the boy directly and said he did not intend to leave this time, but his voice carried no certainty, only intention, fragile and untested. Sarah turned slightly away, her jaw tightening, because intention was something she had learned not to trust without proof. She told him that coming back did not undo years of absence, and that her life had been built in the space he left behind, not in the possibility of his return. William did not respond immediately, and when he finally did, he said he understood more than she believed he could, but understanding was not the same as repairing. The words hung between them, unfinished but undeniable, as Ethan quietly reached for Sarah's hand again, grounding her in the only certainty she had ever fully accepted. And in that moment, standing between the past that shattered her and the present that refused to settle, Sarah realized that whatever William Hayes had come back for, it would not simply be forgiven by being spoken aloud. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, not because of noise or movement, but because of everything that had not been said for years pressing into a single fragile moment. Sarah Mitchell stood still with Ethan holding her hand, her posture controlled but her eyes revealing the exhaustion of a life built on unanswered questions. William Hayes remained a few feet away, his presence calm on the surface yet visibly unsettled in the way his attention kept returning to the child as if confirming something that had long been uncertain. The silence between them was no longer empty, it was layered, filled with memories neither of them had spoken aloud in a long time. Sarah finally broke it by asking him what he expected now, after appearing again as if time had no consequence. William took a slow breath before answering, saying he did not expect forgiveness, only a chance to explain what had been impossible to explain before. Sarah let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh, not out of humor but out of disbelief at how easily words returned after years of absence. She told him that explanations did not raise a child alone at night, did not pay medical bills, and did not replace the sound of someone who was supposed to stay. Ethan looked up at her at that moment, sensing the shift in her emotion, and William noticed it too, his expression tightening briefly before softening again. He asked if the boy ever asked about him, and Sarah hesitated before saying yes, more often than she could ever admit. That answer seemed to affect him more than anything else so far, not because it confirmed guilt, but because it confirmed consequence. William slowly lowered himself slightly to Ethan's eye level, not reaching out, not forcing anything, simply acknowledging his presence. He asked Ethan his name gently, and when the boy answered, there was a brief pause as William repeated it softly, as if committing it to memory in real time. Sarah observed closely, unsure whether to step back or forward, caught between protecting her son and confronting the reality she had avoided for years. William then stood again and turned slightly away, as if gathering himself before continuing. He admitted that leaving was not a simple decision, but he stopped short of using that as justification, instead saying it was something he had carried every day since. Sarah responded immediately, telling him that carrying it was not the same as living it, and that she had done the living while he was gone. Her voice remained controlled, but there was a tremor beneath it that revealed how much restraint it took to remain composed. Ethan shifted closer to her, sensing her tension, and she gently placed a hand on his shoulder without looking away from William. The moment stretched again, longer this time, until William finally asked if he could see Ethan again, not as a right, but as a question that carried uncertainty. Sarah did not answer immediately, and in that pause, everything between them became visible, not just the past, but the fragile possibility of what might come next. She eventually said she did not know, because knowing implied trust, and trust was not something that returned simply because someone came back. William nodded slowly, accepting that answer without resistance, and for the first time there was no attempt to close the distance between them. Instead, there was only recognition that some gaps could not be crossed in a single moment, no matter how much time had been lost or how much regret had been carried. Ethan looked between them, sensing that nothing was resolved but also that nothing was ending, and in that quiet understanding, the world outside continued moving while theirs remained suspended in something unfinished and uncertain. The quiet tension between them lingered even after William Hayes took a careful step back, as if he understood that any movement forward might break something fragile that had just begun to form in the space between truth and silence. Sarah Mitchell remained still, her arm lightly resting around Ethan's shoulder, grounding herself in the only certainty she had left while the rest of her world felt suspended in uncertainty. William's eyes shifted between mother and child, not with urgency, but with a restrained patience that suggested he was no longer trying to force an outcome, only trying to remain present long enough to be allowed one. Sarah finally spoke again, her voice lower now, asking him what he planned to do next, because standing here was not an answer, and she needed to know whether his return meant disruption or something more permanent. William hesitated before responding, saying he intended to stay in the city for the foreseeable future, and that he had already made adjustments to his schedule that would keep him nearby. The answer did not reassure Sarah, but it did not immediately dismiss him either, and that ambiguity felt heavier than certainty. Ethan, sensing the emotional distance between the adults, looked up and quietly asked if William would come visit again, a simple question delivered without expectation, only curiosity. William looked at him directly and said yes, if it was allowed, and the word allowed carried more weight than anything else spoken so far. Sarah noticed that immediately, because it placed control back in her hands, where it had been for years, and that responsibility felt both familiar and exhausting. She told William that visits would not be decided in a hallway conversation and that if he truly wanted to be part of Ethan's life, it would have to be done properly, slowly, and without disruption to the stability she had built alone. William nodded without argument, accepting conditions without resistance, and that quiet acceptance unsettled Sarah more than disagreement would have. There was no attempt to assert power, no corporate confidence, only restraint, as if he understood that anything resembling control would push her further away. A moment later, a staff member from the community center approached, informing Sarah that her intake appointment was still pending and asking if she wished to continue today or reschedule. The interruption gave her a reason to move, and she took it without hesitation, guiding Ethan gently toward the waiting area while William stepped aside to give them space. As Sarah walked, she felt William's presence remain behind her, not following, not leaving, simply existing at a respectful distance that still felt unfamiliar. Ethan looked back once, then faced forward again, as if processing that something important had changed without fully understanding what it meant. Inside the waiting area, Sarah sat down with Ethan beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap as she tried to regain control over thoughts that had become scattered and heavy. She could still feel William nearby, even without seeing him, like a chapter of her life she thought was closed had quietly reopened without permission. Minutes passed before she noticed movement near the entrance again, and when she looked up, she saw William speaking briefly with the receptionist, his expression composed but noticeably distant from the authority he usually carried. He was not intruding, not insisting, only waiting, and that waiting created a different kind of pressure, one that did not demand attention but refused to disappear. Sarah turned her gaze back to Ethan, brushing his hair lightly aside as he leaned closer to her side, seeking comfort in the only consistency he had ever fully known. In that small gesture, she realized something she had been avoiding since William reappeared, which was that the past had not returned to ask for forgiveness, it had returned to exist alongside her present. And whether she allowed it to remain would determine not only what happened next, but how much of her carefully rebuilt world would be forced to change. The waiting room of the community center had settled into a soft kind of silence, the kind that feels temporary, as if the building itself is holding its breath between conversations. Sarah Mitchell sat with Ethan close to her side, her fingers gently resting on his shoulder, grounding herself in the simple rhythm of his breathing while her mind remained elsewhere, still entangled in everything that had happened just moments before. William Hayes was no longer standing in front of her, but his presence had not disappeared, it lingered in the edges of her awareness like a shadow she could not fully step away from. Ethan looked up at her quietly and asked if they were going home soon, and Sarah hesitated for a brief moment before answering that they would, even though she knew nothing about the rest of the day beyond that single promise. Across the room, William stood near a side wall speaking briefly with a staff coordinator, his tone calm and measured, but his eyes occasionally drifting back toward them in a way that suggested he was still anchored to their presence. There was no urgency in him anymore, only a quiet persistence, as if he understood that forcing anything now would only undo whatever fragile opening had formed. After a few minutes, he ended his conversation and remained where he was, no longer approaching, simply observing from a respectful distance that felt unfamiliar to all of them. Sarah noticed this and felt something shift inside her, not comfort, not trust, but a cautious awareness that he was choosing not to take space he once would have claimed without hesitation. A staff member eventually called Sarah's name for paperwork verification, and she stood slowly, guiding Ethan with her as they moved toward the intake desk. William did not follow, but he also did not leave, remaining in the same position as if waiting for permission that had not yet been granted. As Sarah completed the paperwork, she could feel the weight of his presence in the background, not intrusive but constant, like a question that had not been fully answered. Ethan sat quietly beside her, drawing small shapes on a sheet of paper provided by the staff, his attention drifting between his drawing and occasional glances toward the room behind them. When Sarah finished and returned to her seat, she exhaled slowly, trying to regain control of her thoughts, but found that control no longer felt as solid as it had only hours earlier. William eventually moved closer, stopping a few steps away, and asked in a calm voice if everything had gone smoothly with the appointment process. Sarah nodded once, then added that logistics were not the issue, meaning the situation itself was what remained unresolved. He acknowledged that without interruption, his expression steady but subdued, as if he understood she was not speaking about paperwork. A brief pause followed, and Ethan suddenly stood up and walked a few steps toward William, stopping just close enough to look up at him directly. William lowered his gaze to meet the child's eyes without hesitation, and for a moment, either adult spoke. Ethan asked if William would be staying nearby, and William answered honestly that he intended to remain in the city, not just for work, but because there were things he needed to face. The simplicity of that answer seemed to land differently on Ethan than it did on Sarah, who watched carefully for any sign of uncertainty or manipulation. Instead, what she saw was restraint, a man carefully avoiding promises he could not fully guarantee. After a moment, Ethan returned to Sarah's side, and she gently placed her hand on his back again, reaffirming the boundary between safety and uncertainty. William took a small step back, acknowledging that boundary without resistance, and said he would not interfere further today, but that he hoped for another conversation when she was ready. Sarah did not respond immediately, because readiness was not something she could define in the presence of so many unresolved years. Instead, she simply looked at him and said that if anything moved forward, it would be on her terms, at her pace, and with clarity for Ethan above everything else. William nodded once, accepting the condition without argument, and for the first time since his return, there was no tension of pursuit between them, only the fragile outline of something neither of them had yet decided to name. The afternoon light in the community center had shifted slightly, casting longer shadows across the waiting area as Sarah Mitchell remained seated with Ethan beside her, her posture composed but her thoughts increasingly unsettled by the quiet persistence of everything that had unfolded. William Hayes stood a short distance away near the corridor entrance, no longer attempting to close the gap between them, but also refusing to disappear from their orbit, as if presence itself was the only thing he could offer without crossing boundaries she had clearly set. Ethan leaned gently against Sarah's arm, drawing slow lines on the paper in front of him, occasionally glancing up at the room as if trying to understand why the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Sarah kept her attention divided between him and the space where William stood, aware that every choice she made now carried weight beyond this single moment. After several minutes, a staff member approached Sarah again to confirm the final steps of her intake process, and she followed without hesitation, grateful for the structure that allowed her to focus on something concrete. William remained where he was, watching but not intervening, his expression steady but subdued, as though he understood that any attempt to insert himself further would only reinforce distance instead of reducing it. As Sarah completed the final paperwork, she felt a strange dual awareness, one anchored in the immediate needs of her son and the other lingering in the unresolved presence of a man she had once known intimately but now could barely place within the life she had built without him. When she returned to Ethan, she noticed that he was no longer drawing, but instead looking toward William with quiet curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the idea of this stranger who did not behave like a stranger at all. William slowly approached again, stopping at a respectful distance that mirrored the boundaries Sarah had established earlier, and asked in a calm voice if they would be leaving soon. Sarah nodded, confirming that they would be heading out shortly, but added that she still needed clarity on what his presence meant moving forward, because uncertainty could not coexist indefinitely with stability in Ethan's life. William acknowledged this without argument, stating that he did not expect immediate inclusion or resolution, only the opportunity to remain consistent if allowed. The word consistent lingered in Sarah's mind longer than she expected, because it suggested something different from promises, something closer to action over time. Ethan then stood up again and walked a few steps closer to William, stopping just within conversational distance, his expression open and unguarded in the way only children can be when curiosity outweighs caution. William looked down at him and asked if he had had a good day, a simple question that carried no agenda, only presence, and Ethan nodded slightly before asking if William had children of his own. The question created a brief pause in the room, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and William took a moment before answering that he had not been present in the way he should have been, implying more than the words explicitly stated. Sarah observed this exchange carefully, noting that William did not attempt to shift blame or redirect responsibility, but instead allowed the silence that followed to exist without filling it. After a moment, Ethan returned to Sarah's side, and she placed her hand gently on his shoulder, grounding both him and herself in the familiarity of their bond. William took a small step back once again, signaling that he understood the boundary had not changed, and said quietly that he would respect whatever pace she chose, even if that meant distance for longer than he hoped. Sarah met his gaze briefly and replied that respect was not measured in words but in consistency, and that she would be watching for that over time rather than in moments. William nodded once, accepting the condition without resistance, and for the first time since his return, there was no attempt to influence the direction of the moment, only acceptance of its limits. As Sarah guided Ethan toward the exit, she felt the weight of William's presence remain behind them, not as a force pushing forward, but as something unresolved that had not yet decided whether it would become part of their future or remain suspended in their past. The evening air outside the community center carried a cool stillness as Sarah Mitchell stepped out with Ethan holding her hand, the weight of the day settling into her shoulders in a way she could not easily name. The streetlights had begun to glow softly, casting long reflections on the pavement, and for a moment she simply stood there, letting Ethan adjust his small jacket while her mind replayed every interaction from the afternoon. William Hayes had not followed them outside, but his presence still felt close, not physically, but in the way unresolved things tend to linger at the edges of thought long after the moment has ended. Ethan looked up at her and asked if they were going home now, and Sarah nodded, though her answer felt more like habit than certainty. As they walked toward the sidewalk, she noticed a black car parked a short distance away, engine off, windows tinted, and she immediately recognized the quiet restraint of its presence as belonging to William, even before she saw him standing nearby. He did not approach immediately, only watched from a distance as they reached the curb, allowing them space that felt intentional rather than accidental. Sarah paused, unsure whether to acknowledge him or continue walking, and in that hesitation, William stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly but not close enough to impose. He asked if they needed a ride, his tone neutral, careful, as if testing whether practicality could exist without emotional pressure. Sarah declined without hesitation, stating that they would walk, because normalcy mattered more to her than convenience at that moment. William nodded once, accepting the answer without resistance, and that simple acceptance unsettled her more than any argument might have. Ethan, sensing familiarity rather than tension, looked toward the car and asked quietly if it belonged to William, and when Sarah confirmed it, the boy simply nodded as if filing the information away without judgment. William then said he would be nearby for a few days due to business obligations, but he would not interfere unless asked, a statement that carried both restraint and unresolved intent. Sarah responded that proximity alone did not guarantee inclusion, and that presence without consistency would not change anything for Ethan. William acknowledged this again without defense, only saying that he understood, even if understanding did not immediately translate into resolution. For a brief moment, all three of them stood in the same space without moving, as if the distance between past and present had become visible in the air itself. Then Ethan tugged Sarah's hand gently, signaling that he was ready to go, and she began walking without looking back. William remained where he was, watching them leave, his posture still and composed, but his expression carrying something quieter now, not pursuit, but reflection. As Sarah and Ethan moved down the sidewalk, she felt the weight of his presence fade slowly behind them, not gone, but no longer pressing forward. Ethan asked if the man would come back tomorrow, and Sarah hesitated before answering that she did not know, because some answers could not be promised without time. And in that uncertainty, she realized that the past was no longer something she could avoid, only something she would have to define on her own terms before it defined her again. The walk home felt longer than usual, not because the distance had changed, but because silence between thoughts had grown heavier than the city around them. Sarah Mitchell held Ethan's hand firmly as they moved past dim streetlights and quiet intersections, each step grounding her in the physical world while her mind remained partially back at the moment William Hayes had stood watching them from the sidewalk. Ethan stayed close, occasionally glancing up at her face, as if sensing that something unspoken was still unfolding beneath her calm expression. Sarah kept her pace steady, refusing to let her emotions spill into movement, because Ethan needed stability more than he needed answers she did not yet trust herself to form. When they finally reached their small apartment building, the familiar entrance did not feel comforting the way it once did. Instead, it felt like a reminder of everything she had built without help. Inside, the hallway lights flickered softly as they climbed the stairs, and Sarah focused on the simple rhythm of their steps to keep her thoughts from drifting again toward William Hayes and the unresolved weight he had left behind. Ethan broke the silence first, asking if the man from earlier would really come back, and Sarah paused before answering, choosing her words carefully so they did not create promises she could not control. She told him that some people say things in the moment, but only time shows what they truly mean, and Ethan nodded slowly as if accepting that explanation without fully understanding it. Once inside their small apartment, Sarah set down the keys and helped Ethan remove his shoes, moving through routine tasks as a way to anchor herself back into familiarity. The space was modest, softly lit, filled with signs of a life built through endurance rather than ease, and for a brief moment she allowed herself to exhale fully. Ethan went to sit near the small table where he usually drew, while Sarah stood by the counter, her hands resting lightly on its surface. As she tried to organize her thoughts into something manageable, the memory of William's presence did not fade. Instead, it settled into her awareness more clearly now, not as an intrusion, but as a variable she had not accounted for in the structure of her life. Hours later, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Sarah remained awake in the dim light of the kitchen, staring at her phone without unlocking it, as if expecting clarity to appear through stillness. She had not received any messages, no calls, no attempts to bridge the distance that still existed between them, and that silence felt deliberate rather than accidental. Eventually, she placed the phone down and leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for a moment as exhaustion and memory intertwined in a way she could not separate. The following morning arrived with ordinary noise, alarms, distant traffic, and the small routines of preparing for a new day, yet Sarah moved through them with a quiet awareness that something had shifted. When she took Ethan to his morning program at the community center, she noticed a subtle change in how she observed the people around her, as if the possibility of being seen differently had become real again in a way she had not expected. After dropping him off, she stepped outside into the cool air and paused on the sidewalk, her thoughts returning again to William, not as a figure of the past, but as an unresolved presence in the present. Later that afternoon, as she checked her phone during a short break at work, she noticed a single new message notification from an unknown number, and for a brief moment she did not open it, because part of her already understood who it was from. When she finally did, the message was simple, stating only that he had arranged to remain nearby for the next few days and would respect whatever boundaries she set, but would be available if she chose to speak. Sarah read it twice without responding, feeling no immediate shift in emotion, only the steady awareness that her life had not returned to what it was before. And in that quiet realization, she understood that the next decision she made would not be about whether William Hayes was present or absent, but about whether she was willing to let the past define what came next. Sarah Mitchell kept the phone face down on the counter for several seconds after reading the message, as if distance alone could neutralize the weight of it. The words were simple, almost careful, stating that William Hayes would remain nearby and would respect her boundaries while remaining available if she chose to speak, but simplicity did nothing to reduce the impact. It was not an intrusion, not a demand, yet it still altered the shape of her day in a way she could not ignore. She eventually locked the screen and placed the phone back into her pocket, then returned to the task in front of her, a stack of paperwork at the small office where she worked part-time, though her attention no longer fully belonged to the present moment. Each routine action felt slightly detached, as if she were participating in her own life from a small distance. Hours passed in this state until she received a call from Ethan's program at the community center, informing her that he had finished early and could be picked up sooner than planned. When Sarah arrived, Ethan was sitting quietly near the entrance, holding a small drawing he had made during the day, and when he saw her, he stood immediately and walked toward her with familiar comfort. She knelt slightly to meet him, asking about his day, and he explained in simple detail what he had done, his voice steady and untroubled, grounding her more effectively than anything else had that day. As they walked home together, Sarah noticed a black vehicle parked farther down the street than usual, not blocking their path, not drawing attention, but positioned in a way that made its presence unmistakable. She did not stop walking, but she felt Ethan's grip on her hand tighten slightly as he noticed it too. William Hayes was not visible at first, but when they reached the front of their building, he stepped out from a quieter section of the sidewalk, his movement calm and unhurried. He did not approach immediately, only waited at a respectful distance, allowing Sarah to decide whether to acknowledge him. Ethan looked up at her, then back at William, as if silently asking a question she was not yet ready to answer. Sarah paused, then guided Ethan toward the entrance, telling him softly to go inside and wait for her by the stairs, and he obeyed without resistance, disappearing into the building. Only then did she turn back toward William, her expression controlled but clearly guarded. He greeted her without formalities, stating simply that he was not there to disrupt her day, only to ensure that his presence did not feel like uncertainty from a distance. Sarah replied that presence itself was not the issue, it was meaning, and she needed to understand what his continued proximity represented beyond intention. William acknowledged this, saying that he understood trust could not be requested, only earned through consistency over time. The word consistency again settled between them, heavier now because it had been repeated in different forms across several days without resolution. Sarah asked him directly why he had chosen now, after so long, to re-enter a life he had been absent from, and William took a moment before answering, admitting that there had been no single moment of decision, but rather a realization that distance had not erased consequence. He did not offer excuses, only acknowledgement that absence had shaped outcomes he could no longer ignore. Sarah listened without interruption, her posture steady but her emotions shifting beneath the surface as she processed the difference between explanation and repair. When he finished speaking, she told him that understanding the past did not automatically grant access to the present, especially when stability had been built without him. William nodded once, accepting that boundary without resistance, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, allowing the silence to exist without pressure. Ethan reappeared at the doorway, calling softly for Sarah, and she turned slightly toward him, signaling that the conversation was ending for now. William stepped back again, maintaining distance as she walked toward her son, and as she reached him, she felt the weight of his presence behind her no longer pressing forward, but still undeniably there. And as the door closed gently behind them, Sarah understood that whatever William Hayes was trying to become in their lives, it would not unfold quickly, and it would not unfold without consequence. The night had settled over the city with a quiet heaviness, the kind that makes even distant traffic sound softened and far away, as Sarah Mitchell stood in the small kitchen of her apartment and watched Ethan carefully arranging his drawings on the table. He was calm again, focused on small details that gave him comfort, while Sarah remained still, her thoughts drifting in and out of everything that had happened earlier in the day. William Hayes had not returned after she closed the door, but his presence still lingered in her awareness, not as an interruption, but as an unresolved thread woven through every decision she was trying to make. Ethan looked up at her and asked if the man outside would come back tomorrow, and Sarah paused before answering, saying she did not know, because truthfully she no longer trusted certainty in any direction. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Sarah sat alone in the dim light of the living room, her hands resting loosely in her lap while the city outside continued its distant rhythm. She picked up her phone once again, hesitating before unlocking it, and found no new messages, only the earlier ones still sitting there unchanged, waiting without pressure or demand. That silence felt heavier than words, because it did not ask for anything, yet it refused to disappear from her attention. The following morning, Sarah took Ethan to school earlier than usual, walking him through the familiar route while noticing subtle changes in how she observed everything around her, as if awareness itself had become sharper since William's return. Ethan spoke lightly about his plans for the day, and Sarah responded with simple reassurance, though her attention occasionally drifted toward the street behind them, half expecting to see the same black vehicle again. When they arrived at the community center, Ethan hesitated slightly before letting go of her hand, and she knelt down briefly, reminding him that she would return later, grounding both of them in routine. Before stepping away, as Sarah walked back toward the main road, she noticed William Hayes standing farther down the block, not approaching, simply present in a way that suggested patience rather than pursuit. He was dressed in a way that blended into the environment more than before, without the immediate visual distance of authority that usually surrounded him, yet his presence was still unmistakable. Sarah continued walking, not changing her pace, until she reached a point where she could stop without feeling like she was reacting rather than choosing. William noticed her pause and remained where he was, not closing the distance, waiting instead for acknowledgement that did not immediately come. Eventually, Sarah turned slightly toward him and asked why he was still maintaining this level of proximity when she had not agreed to anything beyond limited conversation. William answered calmly that he was not trying to insert himself into her life without permission, only trying to remain consistent in case she chose to speak. The word consistent again appeared between them, and this time it carried more weight because it had become a pattern rather than a promise. Sarah responded that consistency without clarity still created uncertainty, especially for Ethan, who was beginning to notice patterns he did not fully understand. William acknowledged this without argument, and said he would adjust his approach if needed, prioritizing stability over presence if that was what she required. For a moment neither of them spoke, and the distance between them felt neither hostile nor resolved, only carefully maintained. Sarah then told him that if he intended to remain in their orbit, it could not be passive observation, it would require defined boundaries and respect for her decisions without expectation of outcome. William nodded once, accepting the condition without hesitation, and stated that he understood that trust would not be built through proximity alone. As she prepared to leave, Ethan's school coordinator briefly stepped outside to update Sarah on his progress, and she turned her attention away for a moment, breaking the direct line between her and William. When she looked back, he had not moved closer, but he also had not disappeared, maintaining the same careful distance as before. Sarah realized then that the most difficult part was not his return, but the fact that his presence no longer fit neatly into the past she had constructed or the future she had imagined. And as she continued walking back toward her daily routine, she understood that whatever direction this situation would take, it would require her to decide not only what she was willing to forgive, but what she was willing to allow to exist beside her life moving forward. The day unfolded in a quiet rhythm that felt almost fragile, as if any sudden change could break the balance Sarah Mitchell had carefully rebuilt since the morning began. She moved through her responsibilities with Ethan at school and her part-time work occupying separate parts of her attention, yet neither fully separated from the quiet awareness that William Hayes still existed somewhere within the edges of her daily life. Ethan had seemed calmer when she dropped him off, more settled than the day before, but he still asked small questions about whether people who leave can come back and stay, and Sarah had answered with careful neutrality, refusing to give certainty where she did not feel it herself. Later that afternoon, as she finished a shift at the small office where she worked, she stepped outside into a soft, overcast light and immediately noticed William standing across the street, not moving toward her, not leaving, simply present in the same way he had been the day before. There was no urgency in his posture, no attempt to close distance, only a quiet consistency that made him feel less like an interruption and more like a fixed point in a changing environment. Sarah stood still for a moment, observing him from a distance that felt both protective and uncertain, before finally crossing the street to meet him halfway. William greeted her calmly, acknowledging that he had not approached earlier because he was respecting the space she had requested, and Sarah responded that respect without communication still left too many unknowns. He nodded, accepting the observation without resistance, and stated that he was prepared to clarify anything she needed, as long as she was willing to ask. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, and the noise of the city around them felt distant, reduced to background movement that had no influence on the space between them. Sarah eventually asked him why he had not tried to explain himself earlier, before returning, and whether he understood what years of silence had done to her and Ethan's life. William took longer to respond than usual, and when he did, his voice carried a controlled weight, explaining that the circumstances of his departure had involved constraints he had not been able to communicate at the time, but he stopped short of framing it as justification. Sarah listened carefully, her expression steady but her eyes reflecting the accumulation of time that could not be undone by explanation alone. She told him that understanding circumstances did not automatically rebuild trust, and that Ethan's stability could not be shaped by uncertainty that shifted day to day. William acknowledged this again, stating that he was not asking for immediate acceptance, only for the opportunity to demonstrate consistency without expectation of outcome. The word consistency appeared again between them, no longer as a concept but as a condition being tested in real time. Sarah looked away briefly toward the street, gathering her thoughts, then said that if he intended to remain present in any form, it would have to be predictable, structured, and transparent, because unpredictability had no place in Ethan's life. William agreed without hesitation, saying that he would adjust his actions accordingly, even if that meant reducing his presence rather than increasing it. The conversation paused again, not in tension but in evaluation, as if both of them were measuring the gap between intention and consequence. Ethan's school coordinator called Sarah shortly after, updating her on a small upcoming event, and she used the interruption as a moment to step slightly aside, breaking direct focus. When she returned her attention to William, he had not moved closer, but his presence remained steady, no longer shifting between approach and distance, but anchored in a defined boundary. Sarah realized that this was the first time since his return that his behavior matched her conditions without deviation, and that realization did not bring comfort, only clarity. As she prepared to leave, William stated quietly that he would remain in the area but would not interfere unless invited, and Sarah responded that invitation would always depend on trust earned over time rather than proximity maintained over days. He nodded once, and for the first time, there was no negotiation beneath the silence, only acknowledgement of structure being formed where uncertainty had previously existed. Ethan's voice calling from a distance marked the end of the moment, and Sarah turned away, walking back toward her daily routine with the awareness that nothing about her life had resolved, but something fundamental had shifted in how it would now have to be navigated. The next morning arrived with a muted kind of light, the sky over the city covered in a thin layer of gray that softened everything it touched without making it feel any lighter. Sarah Mitchell moved through her routine with careful precision, preparing Ethan for school while her mind remained partially occupied by the structure that had formed over the past several days, a structure she had not fully chosen but now had to navigate with intention. Ethan was quieter than usual, observing her more closely as she packed his small bag, and at one point he asked if the man from before would be at the community center again, a question that carried no emotion beyond curiosity but still made Sarah pause for a moment before answering. She told him that people come and go based on their own choices, and that what mattered most was what stayed consistent around him, not what appeared and disappeared without explanation. Ethan nodded slowly, accepting the answer without further question, and Sarah walked him to school with a sense of measured focus that masked the complexity of her thoughts. After dropping him off, she continued directly to her part-time job, a small administrative office where the day passed in predictable cycles of paperwork and quiet interruptions, yet even there she remained aware of the broader pattern unfolding beyond her immediate environment. By mid-afternoon, when she stepped outside for a short break, she noticed William Hayes already standing near the far end of the street, not approaching, not retreating, simply positioned in a way that suggested continuity rather than pursuit. Sarah did not react immediately, instead observing him for several seconds before crossing the street at a steady pace. When she reached him, there was no greeting at first, only a shared awareness that the conversation between them had not been resolved, merely paused between intervals of time. William spoke first, stating that he had adjusted his schedule further to ensure that his presence remained consistent without becoming intrusive, and Sarah responded that consistency without context still created uncertainty for Ethan, even if intentions were stable. William acknowledged this again, but added that he had also arranged for documentation and communication channels that would allow her to verify his actions independently rather than relying on verbal assurance alone. That detail shifted the conversation slightly, because it introduced structure where previously there had only been proximity. Sarah asked him why he was taking such deliberate steps now, and William explained that after years of absence, he understood that presence alone carried no value unless it was supported by transparency and accountability. The explanation did not erase the past, but it reframed the present in a way that made his actions measurable rather than symbolic. For a moment, Sarah considered this quietly, noticing that his approach no longer resembled the unpredictability she had prepared herself for, but instead reflected an attempt to rebuild interaction through defined boundaries. She told him that while structure was necessary, emotional consequences could not be managed through systems alone, especially when a child was involved. William agreed, stating that Ethan's stability would remain the priority in every decision he made moving forward, and that any engagement would be paced according to what Sarah deemed appropriate rather than what he preferred. The clarity of that statement created a different kind of silence between them, one that was less tense and more evaluative, as if both were now operating within a framework that had to be tested over time rather than argued in moments. Ethan's school coordinator then called Sarah briefly to confirm a small upcoming family activity at the center, and she used the interruption to step slightly away, creating distance without breaking awareness. When she returned her attention, William had not moved, but his posture reflected restraint rather than hesitation, as if he had accepted that his role in their proximity was now defined by limitation rather than pursuit. Sarah finally stated that if he intended to remain part of Ethan's environment in any capacity, it would require long-term consistency that extended beyond convenience or proximity, and William responded that he understood, adding that he was prepared to accept gradual integration rather than immediate access. As the conversation reached its natural pause, Ethan's voice called from a distance, and Sarah turned toward the sound, signaling the end of the exchange without closure but with structure now firmly in place. William remained where he was, not following, not withdrawing, simply existing within the boundaries that had been set, and as Sarah walked back toward her daily responsibilities, she understood that the situation had moved beyond uncertainty into something more defined, where every future interaction would now be measured not by intention, but by sustained action over time. The following morning arrived with a softer clarity than the days before it, as if something within the distance between Sarah Mitchell and William Hayes had finally settled into a form that could be observed without immediately changing shape. Sarah moved through her routine with Ethan in a quieter state of mind, not because uncertainty had disappeared, but because it had been given structure, and structure, even without resolution, allowed her to breathe more evenly. Ethan seemed more at ease as well, no longer asking repeated questions about the presence or absence of William, but instead focusing on small details of his day that anchored him in the present. When Sarah dropped him off at the community center, she noticed that he paused briefly at the entrance, looking back at her with a calm expression that suggested understanding beyond his years, before finally walking inside without hesitation. That moment stayed with her as she continued to her part-time work, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt like something in his world had subtly adjusted to accommodate a reality that was no longer entirely defined by absence. Later that afternoon, when Sarah stepped outside, she did not immediately look for William, and yet she was not surprised to see him already there, standing at a consistent distance that had now become familiar rather than intrusive. He did not approach until she acknowledged him, and when she did, the conversation began without hesitation or tension, as if both of them had accepted that the language between them would now be built on clarity rather than assumption. William informed her that he had finalized arrangements to maintain a predictable schedule in the city for the next several months, not to impose presence, but to ensure that any interaction with Ethan would occur within a stable framework. Sarah listened carefully, then responded that predictability alone was not enough, and that Ethan needed emotional continuity, not just physical availability. William acknowledged this without resistance, and explained that he had begun working with a family liaison consultant to ensure that any involvement he had would be guided by structured expectations and documented consistency rather than spontaneous decisions. That detail shifted something in Sarah's perception, not because it solved the past, but because it demonstrated an effort to transform intention into accountability. She told him that while she could accept structure, she would still reserve full judgment on trust, because trust could not be negotiated through planning, only earned through time. William agreed, stating that he did not expect trust to be immediate or guaranteed, only to remain open to being evaluated through action rather than memory. For a moment, there was no emotional tension between them, only a shared recognition that their connection had moved into a different phase, one defined less by confrontation and more by observation. Ethan arrived shortly after with one of the staff members, and when he saw William, he did not hesitate, but also did not rush forward, instead walking at a normal pace until he reached his mother's side. William greeted him calmly, not as an attempt to claim familiarity, but as a continuation of consistency, and Ethan responded in kind without confusion or discomfort. Sarah watched this interaction carefully, noting that Ethan's comfort level was no longer shaped by surprise, but by repetition, and repetition was slowly replacing uncertainty. After a few minutes, Ethan returned to the activity center, and Sarah remained with William outside, the conversation now softer, less about structure and more about sustainability. William stated that he would continue to maintain distance when necessary and presence when appropriate, depending entirely on Sarah's boundaries and Ethan's stability. Sarah replied that if he continued to respect that framework, then over time she would not prevent supervised interaction with Ethan, provided it remained consistent and emotionally safe. William nodded, accepting the condition without hesitation, and for the first time since his return, there was no sense of negotiation between them, only alignment of terms that had been carefully defined. As the afternoon light shifted slightly, Sarah realized that nothing about the past had been repaired, but something about the present had been stabilized enough to allow forward movement without immediate fracture. When she finally turned to leave, William remained where he was, not following, not withdrawing, simply present within the boundaries that had been established, and as Sarah walked toward her next responsibility, she understood that this was no longer a story of return or absence, but of gradual reconstruction, where every future moment would be measured not by what had been lost, but by what could now be responsibly built.